All right, YouTube. Rand Paul has announced that he's actually intending to endorse Donald Trump. This is something I didn't actually expect. I thought that he would be on the forefront of sort of the Paul Ryans of the party and so forth, sitting this one out, sort of not saying anything. I expected Rubio to come out sooner and endorse Trump. But it looks like Rand Paul wants to get on that bandwagon. Now, I'm sure he has his reservations about this because he can't possibly agree with Trump on deportation, or at least Trump's stated position on deportation. Trump is not a libertarian. He's not even a paleo-conservative. Ron Paul's a paleocon, not really a libertarian per se. Rand Paul is sort of a Goldwater conservative, not even a paleocon. He's a little more lukewarm than his father. Not saying I don't like the dude. I do. I loved how he filibusters constantly. And of course, one of the reasons Ted Cruz never got the momentum he needed is because he abandoned Rand on Audit the Fed. He abandoned him on the NSA. He's not a constitutionalist in any way, shape, or form. He's just a neocon from Canada. But Rand's endorsement matters because there are two kinds of libertarian. There's libertarian and then there's libertarian, in quotations. You have to differentiate between the two. I am a libertarian. I support the Libertarian Party. If someone were a member of some other party and if their positions were actual libertarianism, I wouldn't have a problem with that either. It doesn't have to be, strictly speaking, the dedicated sole hegemonic libertarian party, so long as the policies are basically the same. There's a little bit of wiggle room. I think there can be leeway on certain things because there's still a debate within libertarianism itself over many issues. What do you do about abortion? What about borders? Can you have a libertarian society and have a libertarian border system? These things aren't quite, they're not finished arguments. There's no end-all be-all objective stance for the libertarian movement, and I have my own feelings on them. I'll probably make a video, a more lengthy expose on specifically my views within libertarianism in the near future. Rand Paul, though, is a libertarian. That is, he is a Republican. He is a not quite as partisan as some people within the GOP, but he's a partisan individual. And he simply has embraced several libertarian platforms and happens to use that term loosely. But he has also said explicitly he doesn't consider himself a libertarian. He's a Republican, whereas Ron Paul takes up that title and uses it more frequently to describe his own views. I would agree with that. Paleo-conservative is closer to a libertarian by far than somebody like Rand Paul or Trump. Rand Paul could be seen as the missing link between the traditional Goldwater conservative, which is what I identify Trump as being, sort of a little bit more populism and nativism in there, more of an actual conservative standpoint on taxes, which is great. There's nothing wrong with that, certainly, and a more traditionally conservative view to censorship and free speech and things like that. That is, he stands against the concept that people need to moderate their tone, moderate what they say, simply because some subjective crop of social justice warriors happen not to like it. But Rand Paul is that missing link, and so his endorsement does matter because a growing segment of the GOP is comprised of individuals who identify as Republicans but do not agree with the traditional postmodern, yes, post-Reaganite Republican platform on issues. For instance, the drug war. A growing segment of the GOP does not have a problem with legalizing marijuana. Most of it no longer cares about medical marijuana. And this was a hot button issue even back in the Bush era. It was a huge issue. And the Republicans, Bill O'Reilly was certainly on the forefront of this. People who are partisans within the GOP or supported the GOP and the partisans within the party came out and said it'd be a disaster, it's horrible, it will lead to all sorts of problems. They're wrong. They were clearly wrong at the time. They remain wrong now, but they were the majority within the Republican Party. They're starting to die off. The Bush era is over. The Bush era died a few days ago when Trump cemented the nomination of the Republican Party. He is a Goldwater-style conservative. That is, he is an old guard Republican who nonetheless is not a member of the old guard. He's taking the Republican Party back from the post-Nixon era, with the Southern strategy and all of the police state and the drug war sort of stuff that the Republican Party has endorsed since then, the wars for oil and so forth, the surveillance apparatus, and back to what some people would call Rubish, but a simpler time within the GOP when it actually stood for conservatism. See, the problem is this. The Glenn Becks and Ben Shapiro's and the other talking heads, pundits, and zealots within the Republican Party that comprise it, the Boehners, the McConnells, and so forth, are themselves, while they claim others are not conservative enough, they're the ones that are not conservative. They're neocons, but a neocon isn't even a conservative. I'm not sure why we even bother using that title. They're not conservative. Their fiscal policy is arguably more demonic than the stuff that the Democrats are talking about. The liberals, again so-called, want to fritter away our money on social programs and welfare and stuff like that. Well, that's bad enough, but the Republicans want to fritter it away on bombing people and making more wars in the future. I would think that's arguably worse in many ways. They're the same thing. The neocon and the neoliberal are basically identical. They simply disagree on what they want to spend your hard-earned money on, who they want to kill, what types of speech they wish to suppress. That's the only real difference between them. Which sort of religious movements they have a problem with. For instance, the New Wave left has no problem with Islam. If you're an Islamic zealot, you're their friend somehow. You're still an extremist. If you're a Christian, though, of course, you're their enemy. The Republicans, the modern neocon movement's the opposite. If you're Islamic, even if you're like a liberal Muslim, they have a problem with you. If you're a Christian, it doesn't matter how crazy you are, even if you sound like a Christian ISIS member, you're still somehow, you're in their good graces. Trump is not like that. He's avoided some of these wedge issues from the past. For instance, on the transgendered issue, he is openly stating that he's ambivalent to it. Well, congratulations to him for showing common sense on that issue. I think that sort of stuff might be what Rand Paul is ingratiated towards him about. I have a feeling that they've spoken privately. I have to assume that that's the case. I think that Trump is far more... I don't think Trump's in favor of the drug war. And I think that the reason why he was half-hearted when explaining his views on the drug war is because he realized that it would hurt him with the GOP electorate during the nomination process if he openly said, yeah, I don't care if people smoke weed as long as I can tax it. Now, I go further than that. I think we should legalize it and not even bother to tax it. But I guess it's a step in the right direction, so to speak. Rand Paul is not a libertarian, strictly speaking, but he is closer to that sort of golden utopian core of believing in our traditional values than any neocon will ever be, than any neoliberal will ever be, than a socialist like Sanders or a corporatist like Hillary or Cruz would ever be, or the evangelicals. The one thing I would say Rand Paul really kind of turned me off to his message regarding would be sort of the religious aspect of it. That is, I'm finding it difficult to understand how someone who understands the topic of liberty in the context of the drug war or guns or something like that can then completely ignore it when it comes to religious liberty, or whether the government should be involved in deciding who gets a property contract called marriage or something like that. I don't fully comprehend why he would have that sort of mixed bag of beliefs. But it's better than nothing, and his endorsement does carry weight. He retains a small but very rabid fan base of individuals who really are appreciative of his message. Many of them are holdovers from the Ron Paul era, and they're rabid in regards to what they believe in. Now, Rand has openly differentiated himself from his father on many things, not just issues, but disclaiming the title libertarian. Obviously, Ron Paul is not particularly fond of Trump. However, you have seen Ron Paul retweet regarding an article saying, oh, well, maybe he could be Secretary of State. I pointed out before, the neocons may be terrified of the idea. I think it's a great idea. I think Ron Paul should be Secretary of State. Put Rand in as Secretary of the Treasurer. maybe Chris Christie is Secretary of Commerce or something, and you're already starting to build a team of individuals that really would draw in the youth to the Republican Party for the first time since the 1980s, even more so than it's starting to get trickle back into it now. Get some people in there that are more friendly to the neocons. Yeah, you got to throw one or two bones to the neoconservatives to get more votes from the partisans that don't really believe in any issues at all. You got to understand, modern neoconservative voter is different from a modern neoconservative politician. The neocon politician wants wars for profit and a police state, stuff like that. But the voter doesn't really strongly believe in any issues whatsoever, other than they believe in Jesus and they pretend to actually care about this issue. They will simply vote for whoever has the R after their name or who mentions Jesus and killing other people more. To get them on Trump's side, not that you need their votes, but it's nice to win in a landslide as opposed to a close election. Yeah, you got to throw them a bone or two. I think Chris Christie would honestly qualify as a neocon, though, all things considered, which is pretty funny considering the state that he's in charge of. Yeah, Rand Paul's endorsement matters. It doesn't really matter to me because, again, early on, Rand was doing very well. On the drug war, on taxes and so forth, his issues were very good. And I said at the time, I supported Rand Paul. I didn't expect him to win, but I supported him. I thought his message was the best out of any of the Republican candidates who were in the race at its height, when everyone was still in. But then he sort of fucked himself because he started rambling about moral issues, and he outed himself as not really being libertarian on these things. He still has that authoritarian moralist core, and I think that he's primarily endorsing Trump because they share similar fiscal beliefs. Trump came out some time ago and said, yeah, we should audit the Fed. That's something that's been a pet project of Rand Paul's for a very long time. You see growing dissent within the Democratic Party to do the same thing. Sort of the Bernies and Warrens don't really have a problem with the idea of keeping our fiscal system accountable. It's the Hillarys and the Ted Cruzes that don't want you to look too deeply within these companies and banks' accounts, because you'll find that they themselves are definitely implicated. That's a certainty. Cruz and Hillary and all these others, they embezzle hundreds of millions of dollars a year from the American taxpayers. It's a certainty. Many hundreds of politicians and bureau heads do this. As for Rand, he's sort of a niche senator, and I think what finally drove him over the edge was coal, because Hillary Clinton has openly called for putting miners and so forth out of business. That is not I don't know what possessed her to think this was a good idea. Is this going to help her in Pennsylvania? Oh, wait, I don't think so. What about Ohio? What about Indiana? These states that are in this sort of region, the Rust Belt, they're going to be completely turned off to Hillary Clinton's message. And all Trump has to do is out-liberal the so-called liberal Hillary Clinton, who's not a liberal at all on drugs, and he'll grab up New Hampshire and Colorado. The way forward for Trump, you may think that it's hard because he's been labeled a sexist, a bigot, a vile person. It doesn't matter, though. It will not affect him. I'm telling you right now that if he says the things I expect him to say and performs a halfway decent job at the presidential debates in the general election, he will win in a landslide. Hillary Clinton will have absolutely no chance against him. You'll see a clean sweep of most of the swing states. You'll see formerly fairly blue states turning red or being toss-up states and having a close shave there. Hillary may lose a few, win a few, so to speak, and she will lose. And I've said fairly early on in the primary process that Trump was at a great advantage, that I liked Rand Paul, but he wasn't going to win. Trump was the front runner. Trump was the one with the momentum. A lot of people didn't want to believe that. They thought either the establishment would jerry-rig the system somehow to get Cruz or Rubio back up there, or even Jeb, and that they would supplant him, that they would solidify. I said it's not going to happen. I was right. Some people still thought that a candidate like Fiorina or Carson or something could rise up and become the new outsider contender. It didn't happen. It was obvious that it wasn't going to happen. You can literally look graphically at the polling averages on RCP, that's all you needed to do, because you could compare it to past races and see the astronomic rise of these candidates, unless they stabilize very quickly, coincides with a fall back to their long-term mean. The only candidate who defied that is Donald Trump. He was the only one he got in, he quickly supplanted Jeb, and he stayed at that plateau and slowly over time built up more and more support. Rand Paul, at one point in the race, had, I think, 10-15% support. It was similar to Ron Paul. I think what happened is that the Ron Paul supporters, the holdovers, they very early on said, well, Rand's obviously our man. He's the son of Ron Paul, so we're going to support him. When Rand made the mistake of outing himself as having moralist views, he was no longer taken seriously by most of those people. They started to jump ship. Who did they jump ship to? I'm willing to bet Trump and Carson. Now Carson, of course, is on Trump's team and was early on. Rand Paul's jumping aboard. So he will, I believe, solidify most of the so-called libertarians within the GOP under his banner. That gives him that gives him several million young individuals that will be voting for the GOP that, frankly, before the era of Ron Paul would have been Democrats. That is, they are essentially progressive on drugs and gays and abortion. They don't really care about the moral issues. They're the new Republicans. They don't really give a fuck about that. And this is why I say the Republican Party will become a de facto libertarian movement within a generation or two, because these will be the new core of voters in another 10 to 20 years. It will be, or at least it'll be a Goldwater-style party as opposed to a Nixonian party. That's number one. Number two, on fiscal issues, though, they can't vote for the Democratic Party because they realize the Democrats don't really understand fiscal issues, that you can't simply spend your way out of a recession, that the Democrats also are like the neocons. They like the expensive wars. They don't want to really crack down on waste, fraud, abuse, corruption, because they're all involved in it. Wall Street is like their piggy bank, their solid gold piggy bank that they get kickbacks from. They're all taking money from the same people. The Democrats, too, are beginning to see it. The younger Democrats, the sort of Bernie fans, the Elizabeth Warren fans, think what you will about their fiscal beliefs, but they at least understand that the two-party system that a lot of people believed in lock, stock, and barrel for so many years doesn't work anymore, that the two parties are the same thing. They have converged on so many different issues, and on the worst issues they could converge on, with the worst possible opinions about them that they could formulate, that it's no longer even worth voting for these two parties. So you have reform movements in both of the parties that will drive them apart, and if that fails, a third party will rise up. Those are the options for the establishment. You will either get a mainstream third party that will rip those two parties to pieces, or those two parties will diverge again. What it looks like is that you're going to end up with a fiscally further left but socially somewhat more progressive Democratic Party, sort of a Bernie party, and a throwback Goldwater actual conservative movement in the Republican Party that actually attempts to constrain spending and hold taxes down, that doesn't care so much about the moral issues, the sort of Jesus stuff that really fucked the Republican Party for several election cycles, and isn't so much a pro-war party. You might see the Democrats become the pro-war party. That would shock a lot of people. It would be like, the times of Lyndon Baines Johnson or something like that. If you look back through our political history, these paradigm shifts happen more often than you want to believe. Essentially, our nation, the two-party system as it is now, has been the same since the early 1990s. Indeed, since sort of the 80s, sort of the time of Reagan versus Mondale. That paradigm shift under Reagan led to what we have now. Technically, Herbert Walker Bush ushered in the true neoconservative age. Reagan was more of a charismatic figurehead. Herbert Walker was the corrupt one. He was jerry-rigged in as vice president under Reagan by the Republican establishment. Trump needs to avoid that at all costs, because then we'll have a brief reprieve from the stupidity we've been under. Trump will be like Goldwater or Reagan or something, and then we'll go right back to the bad old days. He needs to choose as a running mate somebody who potentially, if they run down the road, will not be a complete asshat. Rand Paul like I said, is probably the only figure within the legislature at the moment that would actually make an appropriate vice presidential candidate. I'm still thinking Kasich, who isn't perfect, but he's a Reaganite, better, I suppose, better than Jeb Bush, better than somebody like that. And like I said, I'm a libertarian. I'm not ingratiated to Trump's platform. I agree with him on some things. Better than Hillary. Yes, he would be a better president than Hillary Clinton would be. But then again, a box of shit would probably be better as a president than Hillary Rodham Clinton. So that's not saying much. I mean, I can say some positive things about Trump. He's not a neocon. That's great. Is he perfect? No. Is Hillary perfect? Anything but perfect. She will also probably be the nominee. If it was Bernie Sanders, honestly, I think that he would put up much more resistance to Trump, and the election would be closer. I think he'd still lose, but the election would be a lot closer than with Hillary, because the Democrats wouldn't begin hemorrhaging a bunch of business liberals, a bunch of the youth vote. I think the young, for the first time in many decades, will be voting mostly Republican this time around. Your friends may not admit to it, but a lot of them will probably be voting for Trump when they realize how bad Hillary Clinton really is. So yeah, Rand has endorsed Trump. It's good news for Trump. He needed it, honestly. He needs to amalgamate the younger Republicans that are more libertarian, not libertarians specifically, but more libertarian on more issues. He needs to amalgamate them behind his banner. If he doesn't manage to do that, then all bets are off. I think he will. I think this goes 75% of the way towards doing so. Now all he needs to do is choose a couple of issues to temper himself on, move more towards libertarianism on. The drug war would be an excellent idea because he can outmaneuver Hillary completely. All of a sudden, the Democrats become the tired, bored party of old people that are voting for a bunch of outdated multicultural gibberish. And the Republicans, suddenly, for the first time since the Reagan youth, become the cool party, the in party. Well, you know, the term conservative, as used by the Bushes and the Boehners of the Republican Party, yeah, that will attract the youth vote. Yay, more wars. That's exactly what we need. We need to keep throwing people in jail for smoking weed. Aren't we cool? So rad and tubular, dude. Since when have you seen anybody within the Republican Party whose last name isn't Paul, who actually seems hip to the youth, that actually even comprehends the youth of today, that isn't just out there to like ban a new CD or something? It's been a long time. The Republican Party is capable of doing it. The Democrats are at their weakest since the mid-1980s. It should be easy to absolutely steamroll them off the face of the earth and cause their party to crumble, forcing another paradigm shift of the Democratic Party. If the Hillarys lose, then the Bernies and Warrens rise. You actually, regardless of what you think about the party's actual positions on things, whether you think they're terrible or great, that would at least mean the average voter has a choice, because the two parties are no longer a de facto one-party system. So good on Paul for doing this. I mean, what the fuck was he going to do? Just sit there and not endorse anyone because he doesn't like the nominee? Paul Ryan's trying to do that, and he's getting all sorts of flack for it. He'll probably be out of a job. He's not going to get voted back into office. Trump will win. Trump will chuckle at Paul and say, at Paul Ryan, and say, oh, well, you didn't want to support me. Well, maybe I won't support you either. Maybe I'll tell people to vote for your opponent, and I'll try to get you tossed out in the primaries in your state. That'd be rather funny. Paul Ryan's a neocon. He pretended that he liked Ayn Rand or whatever the fuck he was talking about. Well, he's just a fucking corporate neocon warmonger shill, and a Zionist as well, just like most of the others that are in office. That's about all. Peace out.